Welcome to the shadows. This is Mrs. Sinister, where terrifying tales lull you to sleep. Brian stepped through the sliding glass doors of Mercy Heights Private Hospital with his ID badge swinging proudly from a lanyard, his crisp uniform smelling faintly of detergent and ambition. Fresh out of nursing school, his nerves buzzed with a heady blend of eagerness and optimism. He had read somewhere that nurses were often the backbone of any medical institution, and he came ready to prove himself, not only to the senior staff but to himself, and to the idea that all the sleepless nights of studying and relentless hours of clinical work had been worth it. The hospital stood like a polished giant, modern, angular, with spotless marble floors and touchscreen directories mounted in the lobbies. Patients paid for silence and speed at Mercy Heights, and the hospital delivered both. The halls smelled sterile and efficient. Every window reflected wealth. Every room buzzed with discretion. There were no groaning emergency ward lines, no cluttered charity bins, no chipped tiles or outdated blood pressure monitors. It was everything Brian had wanted. An elegant stepping stone to financial stability and professional esteem. He'd been warned by classmates that some hospitals, no matter how state-of-the-art, carried a shadow with them. A haunting, they'd said with smirks and nervous shrugs. Ghosts in abandoned wings, elevators that traveled to wrong floors, whispers in long corridors at night. Brian had rolled his eyes then, and now, even as he heard something, a faint hum, maybe voices, he still rolled his eyes. Of course, hospitals are haunted. Where else would the dead go? But he hadn't come this far to be frightened by folklore. He reminded himself of the salary, the benefits, the promise of a bright future. Still, there was something odd. On his first night shift, while replacing IV bags in the East Wing, Brian thought he heard someone weeping. Faintly. Not the moaning of a post-op patient or the muttering of someone disoriented. This was different. Deliberate, guttural crying, echoing faintly through the ventilation shafts. He paused, blinked, then carried on. During his second week, he passed by room 511, a suite that had been marked vacant on his rounds list, and caught a glimpse of someone sitting upright in the bed. The figure was emaciated, draped in thin fabric, unmoving. Brian froze, took a step back, rechecked the chart, and cautiously opened the door. The room was empty. He laughed quietly, told himself it was sleep deprivation, and moved on. But by his third week, the strange events began to escalate. Lights flickered only when he was alone in rooms. The emergency call buttons buzzed in empty wards. The hallway intercoms hissed with static, sometimes humming in a low frequency that sent chills up his spine. Still, he pushed on. Big salary, he reminded himself. It was all in his head. One night, he found blood dripping from the ceiling of the restroom in the administrative wing. Not just a stain, but actual red droplets, fresh and slow, trailing from the overhead tile down the mirror, pooling faintly in the sink. He reached to alert maintenance, but when he turned back for another glance, it had vanished. No trace of it. Just his wide-eyed reflection blinking back at him in confusion. His performance began to suffer. He made small errors, chart mix-ups, missed doses. He found it harder to concentrate. Patients complained about him seeming distracted, even frightened. Some of the other nurses, mostly older and less charitable, began to exchange looks when he passed. A few whispered when he arrived for shift handoffs. His reputation, once polished and bright, now seemed to trail behind him in whispers, just like the ones in the ventilation shafts. But the worst part wasn't the hospital anymore. It was the dreams. At first, they were fragmented. Echoes of white halls, crying voices, blurry figures. But soon they became vivid and suffocating. He would dream of a woman whose lower jaw was missing, crawling across the tiles with bloodied fingertips, calling out silently. He saw a boy with charred skin, his eyes hollow, standing at the foot of his bed, whispering a name that wasn't Brian's. The worst dream was the one where he awoke strapped to a gurney, being wheeled by ghostly nurses with melted faces, their mouths hanging open as though screaming, though no sound came. He began to dread sleep. He stopped eating properly. Shadows seemed to move when he wasn't looking. Reflections in windows and monitors showed things he couldn't explain. Once, while walking past an ICU room, he saw a patient flatlining, no alarms blaring, no nurses reacting. When he rushed in, the room was empty. The monitor was off. The veil between reality and illusion began to thin. He started avoiding eye contact with patients and staff, afraid of who might not be real. The line had blurred. There was one elderly woman in particular, Mrs. Halprin, room 602, who he swore had passed away 2 nights prior. He had been present during the code blue. He remembered the flat line, the chart being updated. But then she appeared again, days later, asking him for water, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. He spilled the water and fled. One morning, after a full night shift, he stood staring into the utility room's metal sink, his reflection murky in the silver faucet. His hands trembled. There was a voice behind him, faint but unmistakable, that whispered his name. When he spun around, no one was there. He vomited in the sink and wept silently, his knuckles pressed against the cold metal as though trying to wake up. The others noticed. He was written up twice for lateness. He misfiled medications. He almost administered morphine instead of saline during a night of especially heavy hallucinations. His hands shook as he double-checked. He knew something was coming. Something was waiting for him to make a mistake. It didn't have to wait long. It happened on a Wednesday, in the recovery ward. He was exhausted. His head felt like it was full of cotton and static. Room 519. A young man, post-surgery, low pain threshold. Brian remembered walking in, his mind swirling. The patient asked something, maybe for meds, maybe for water. Brian couldn't tell anymore. His ears rang constantly now. He looked at the name. The chart blurred. He remembered the wrong drawer. The patient coded 5 minutes later. The doctor's shouting was muffled, like underwater. Someone pulled Brian away. There were hands on his arms, voices in his ears, the overhead lights spinning. He thought he saw Mrs. Halprin again, standing in the hallway, blood trailing from her gown, staring. The investigation was brief but damning. His error was documented. He wasn't fired. He quit before they could make the decision for him. He packed his locker in silence, avoiding eye contact with the others. No one stopped him. A few glanced up from their charts, but returned to their notes as if nothing had happened. In a place like Mercy Heights, mistakes couldn't be allowed to echo for long. Reputation was everything. Appearances mattered more than people. Brian left his badge at the front desk and walked out into the morning sunlight that felt too sharp, too loud, too vivid. He wandered the parking lot, hands deep in his pockets, his skin crawling. He wasn't sure if he was alone. He wasn't sure anymore who was real. He moved out of his apartment a few weeks later, disconnected his phone, left the city. Some said they saw him in smaller towns, working odd jobs. Others heard he tried to apply for a nursing position again, but never followed through. No license reactivation was ever filed. No one at Mercy Heights spoke of him again. Just another nurse who didn't last. Another burnout. Another casualty. But late at night, when the intercoms hiss and the lights flicker in the hallways, some of the staff swear they see a young man standing by the recovery ward. His badge still clipped to his shirt, his hands trembling, watching, waiting, listening to the whispers. Dr. Emil Sanchez had always considered medicine to be his calling, a divine path chosen for him. He was never the most brilliant among his classmates, nor the most ambitious, but he had something rare, a heart tuned to compassion and a steadfast faith that guided his hands in moments where logic failed. He prayed silently before surgeries, crossed himself before entering the ICU, and lit a candle every Friday in the hospital chapel, offering it to no saint in particular, but to the general mercy of heaven. For a decade, he served in St. Celestine's Medical Center, a modest yet clean private hospital with white walls that were never quite free of the smell of antiseptic and hidden despair. It was on a particularly warm Monday morning in late October that he first saw Mrs. Lee Foreman. She was brought in by her husband and eldest son after fainting in their kitchen. The report said she had collapsed near the sink, breaking a ceramic mug as she fell. The husband, Mr. Sam Foreman, appeared well-kempt but visibly shaken. Their son, Eric, stood with his arms crossed tightly, watching the nurses move his mother onto a gurney. Mrs. Foreman herself was conscious when Dr. Sanchez arrived, though dazed. Her voice was soft, but she winced as if every sound was a hammer to her temples. Her pulse was erratic, her pupils dilated, and sweat formed along her forehead in a pale sheen. Initial tests showed nothing remarkable. CT scan, normal. Blood chemistry, unremarkable. Neurologically, she was fine. When Dr. Sanchez asked if she'd ever experienced anything like this before, she shook her head, shielding her eyes from the fluorescent lights. Her headaches had been growing in frequency, she admitted quietly. She hadn't told anyone. The seizures, 2 in the last month, she had hidden as panic attacks. The fainting was new. He admitted her for observation. By Tuesday, her condition had worsened. Not physically. On paper, she remained within normal limits, but her demeanor had shifted. She no longer responded to casual greetings. Her body was tense, her hands curling into fists under the sheets. Dr. Sanchez noticed her lips moved slightly, constantly, even when she wasn't speaking. When he leaned closer, he heard nothing. Perhaps a hum, perhaps nothing at all. On Wednesday, Nurse Jocelyn reported the first outburst. She had gone to take Mrs. Foreman's vitals when the woman suddenly screamed and threw her meal tray across the room. It had taken 2 nurses to restrain her while she kicked and howled in a language none of them recognized. Sanchez was summoned immediately. By the time he arrived, she was breathing heavily, sitting on the bed, her eyes wide and fixed on the corner of the ceiling. He tried to speak to her gently, tried to ask if she remembered what had happened. Her gaze never left the ceiling. Her lips were twitching again. That night, he reviewed her case file again and again. No signs of infection, no neurological disorders, no prior psychological history. Her EEG showed no epileptiform activity. There was no reason, no scientific, tangible reason for this behavior. He spent an extra hour in the chapel that night, lighting a second candle. By Thursday, Dr. Sanchez began to dread entering her room. The air was always cold in there, and not just because of the AC. It felt heavier, as if the room had filled with smoke that no one could see. Nurses began to avoid her room. They said nothing directly, of course, but Sanchez noticed the subtle shifts in their behavior. Vitals left untaken, meds left outside the door. She was still having outbursts, though they grew more violent. She bit one nurse's hand. Another time, she tried to pull out her IV, screaming hoarsely at her own reflection in the television screen. Her family, when visiting, seemed genuinely concerned. Mr. Foreman wept one afternoon, asking if it was a brain tumor they'd missed. The children, 3 in total, the youngest only 8, stood silently by the bed, confused and frightened. Dr. Sanchez could find nothing wrong. He ordered more tests, psychiatric evaluations, MRI. All came back clean. He even contacted a specialist in the capital for a second opinion. They offered theories: conversion disorder, dissociative seizures, but no real answers. The hospital psychologist found her uncooperative, unwilling to speak, and increasingly agitated in sessions. On Friday, Dr. Sanchez was sitting in the nurse's station reviewing reports when the lights flickered. He thought nothing of it. Old building. But then a loud bang came from the hallway. He ran to room 309, Mrs. Foreman's room, and stopped just short of opening the door. The air was cold. The hallway seemed dimmer. When he stepped inside, the first thing he noticed was that all the furniture had been pushed to the sides of the room. The bed remained in place, but she was not in it. She stood in the corner. Her head was tilted back, her mouth wide open as if caught in a scream, though no sound came out. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Then the lights went out entirely for 3 seconds. When they came back on, she was lying in bed again, trembling. He called for assistance, ordered a sedative, and stayed with her for an hour. He prayed quietly under his breath, unsure why, unsure what he feared. Over the weekend, she remained sedated, but the feeling in her room grew worse. The chapel candle he lit in her name flickered violently, though there was no wind. He began dreaming strange dreams. Fields of blackened trees, shadows writhing just out of reach, the sound of claws on tile. He attributed it to stress. On Monday, she woke from her sedation with a scream that echoed down the hallway. She clawed at her face, gouging long lines into her cheeks. She had to be restrained. When he checked on her, she looked at him for the first time in days. Really looked, and her eyes were wrong. The color seemed deeper, almost black. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a low, guttural growl came out, followed by something like a laugh. He stepped out of the room and nearly collapsed in the hallway. His knees buckled, his hands shook. For the first time in his medical career, Dr. Emil Sanchez was afraid of a patient. That night, he went home and opened a drawer in his bedside table that he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small, worn crucifix his mother had given him. He held it in both hands and stared at it, saying nothing, thinking everything. When he slept, he dreamed of the hospital room. Only it wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a cavern, slick with blood, filled with chanting voices in reverse, and something sat in the bed, grinning. He didn't go to the chapel that day. He drove to a nearby church instead, St. Raphael's. He didn't know what he was doing. He simply walked inside, stared at the stained glass of Michael defeating the devil, and then knelt in the pew, clutching his mother's crucifix. He didn't speak to the priest. He wanted to. He planned to, but something held his tongue. Back at the hospital, he reviewed her case one last time. All the pages were stained with scribbles. At some point, someone, or perhaps himself, had written the same phrase over and over in the margins of her chart. "It is watching." He didn't remember writing that. He didn't remember seeing it before. That night, he brought holy water from the church and sprinkled it at her doorway. Her eyes snapped open. She shrieked with such force the walls seemed to shake. But the moment passed. She collapsed again, breathing heavily, unconscious. He knelt beside her bed, afraid to look away. And then he felt it. A presence. Not seen, not heard, but undeniably there. A weight on his shoulders, a gaze pressing into his back. He turned around quickly, but the room was empty. The lights flickered again. He knew then, knew with every part of his soul, that this was not medical. This was not scientific. Something was inside her. Something ancient. Something evil. The next morning, he called St. Raphael's and asked for Father Abbot, an old priest known for his exorcism work. He didn't tell the hospital. He didn't tell the family. He just needed confirmation. Someone to validate that he wasn't losing his mind. He planned to meet the priest the next day, to bring him in discreetly. But he never got the chance. When he arrived at the hospital, room 309 was empty, the beds stripped, the monitors off. The nurses said the family had come early and discharged her against medical advice, signed the forms, took her home. Dr. Sanchez rushed to the parking lot, but they were gone. He tried calling. The number was disconnected. No forwarding address, no warning. Just gone. He stood in the middle of the room they had occupied for over a week and felt nothing but silence. Riva hadn't planned to start over, but heartbreak has a way of shoving people forward, even if their feet drag through the dust of the past. It had been 2 weeks since she left the hospital where she and Ace had both worked. 2 weeks since she folded her scrubs for the last time, stuffed them into her duffel bag, and walked out of the place where everything began and ended. She hadn't cried in the car. She hadn't screamed. She simply drove. And when St. Joseph General Hospital called back with a contract, she signed it without asking too many questions. The building itself was aged but not decrepit, a colonial-style facade, too pristine for the gray concrete bones that hid behind it. Inside, the scent of antiseptic barely masked the older odor of mildew and something faintly metallic. The floors gleamed, but the hall still felt cold. Her first day was uneventful. She got lost 3 times, almost missed a med pass, and took her lunch in the staff pantry alone. That night, she walked back to her apartment in silence, brushing raindrops off her shoulders, with the same numb patience she used to wipe away her tears a week ago. By the 3rd day, something changed. She first heard it while stalking gauze in the empty trauma room. Room 212. A soft cry, barely audible, like a child muffling pain into a pillow. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. She paused, turning to check the hallway, but found nothing. The room was still, the overhead fluorescent light flickering faintly. She didn't tell anyone. It didn't seem worth mentioning. Maybe she was tired. Maybe it was just the wind. Although none of the windows opened and there was no storm outside. That night, she dreamed of the hallway. It stretched endlessly under blue-tinted emergency lights, gurneys pushed against walls, ivy poles casting long shadows. In her dream, she was running, not from something, but toward it. At the end of the corridor stood a figure. She couldn't see his face, just his silhouette, and the way he slowly turned to walk away. When she awoke, sweat clung to her skin like a second set of scrubs. The ceiling above her seemed lower than usual, and she could still hear the echo of her shoes against the tile in her mind. More days passed, and the crying returned. Sometimes louder, sometimes closer. She started noticing figures in the corners of her eyes, just fleeting movements, shoulders disappearing into doorways, feet dragging behind carts, silhouettes flickering across the frosted glass of isolation rooms. They never stayed, but she started feeling watched, not by her colleagues, who were polite and distant, but by something else, something patient. One night, while restocking the pharmacy cabinet, she saw the girl. The pediatric ward had been closed for renovation for almost a year. The wallpaper peeled, and the paint flaked from the corners. The doors had been sealed with tape, yet when she passed the entrance, she saw a small handprint pressed into the dusty glass, the size of a child's. Inside, a little girl in a blue gown stood beneath a flickering light, her eyes too large for her face. She didn't speak, just stared. Riva blinked, and the child was gone. But the handprint remained for hours afterward. She started carrying a rosary in her scrub pocket, not because she was religious, but because her mother had always said it was a shield. Riva needed one, even if it was made of false comfort and beads. But comfort is fragile, especially when the crying began to follow her home. At first, it was a whisper through the walls of her apartment. Then, a thump in the closet. Once, she returned to find every mirror in the place covered in fog, as though someone had been breathing heavily against the glass. The chill never left after that. She began to sleep with the lights on, but dreams still found her. Now, they always led back to the hospital, to the long corridor, to the figure that resembled Ace, her ex-boyfriend, more and more with each passing night. But Ace wasn't dead. He was alive, somewhere, moving on, and she couldn't. The hauntings grew stronger with her sorrow. Her grief took root in her ribs, a weight that thickened her blood. She saw the girl again, this time at the end of the hallway near the supply closet, swaying slightly, face pale and empty. Then there was the man in room 407, a patient who had died months before her arrival. His chart had been archived, yet Riva found it left on her desk one morning. No one claimed responsibility. She checked the morgue register. He had died of sepsis, alone. She felt drawn to that room. Sometimes, she'd pass by and feel a pressure against her chest, like invisible fingers resting on her collarbone. A silent plea to enter. She never did. One shift, during a blood run to the lab, the elevator stopped on the 3rd floor. The doors opened to darkness. No lights, no voices, just a long, black hall stretching beyond her sight. She hadn't pressed that floor. Her hands trembled, and she jammed the close button. Just before the doors sealed shut, she saw them. Figures lining the walls. Dozens, each watching, silent, waiting. She told no one. There were no explanations that wouldn't make her sound insane. She looked up St. Joseph's history. No major fires, no unsolved deaths, no whispers of malpractice or satanic rituals. But there were stories buried in old forums, lost in backlogs of staff threads. Nurses who had quit after a few months, citing nightmares. A janitor who refused to clean the West Wing alone. A doctor who drank himself to death in a call room. Nothing official, just ghosts in the wires, but too many to ignore. One night, after an especially long shift where every light in the ICU flickered in sync and the intercom played garbled static, Riva stayed late. Something pulled her. The sorrow wasn't lifting. It was thickening. She hadn't spoken Ace's name in days, yet his face loomed in every reflective surface she passed. Her heart ached with a hollow kind of pressure, the kind that makes people leave their keys in the ignition just to feel like they could still run if they wanted. She wandered the halls past midnight. The hospital was quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating silence of anticipation. She passed the pediatric ward again. The tape had been torn. Inside, the little girl stood, pointing toward the far wall. Riva entered. She couldn't help it. The wallpaper peeled around her as if revealing veins beneath old skin. The girl vanished when Riva stepped fully into the room. On the far wall, behind a shelf, she found an old mirror, covered in dust, yet strangely intact. Written in streaks across the glass were words she hadn't said aloud in months. "I miss you, Ace." She hadn't written them, but they were hers. They were her truth, carved out in silence. Suddenly, the lights above her flickered and burst. The room plunged into shadow, and from the mirror, faces began to form. Dozens, crying, screaming. Their mouths moved without sound, but Riva could feel their grief pressing against her chest. Her sorrow, mirrored in theirs, bound them together. She ran, but sorrow is a chain. It follows. It pulls. She fled back to the nurse station, heart pounding, breath ragged. Behind her, the intercom crackled, then wept, a sound like 1,000 voices crying through the wires. She covered her ears, but the grief was inside her now. That's when she realized the truth. They weren't haunting her because of who she was, but because of what she carried. Grief, unprocessed, endless, a wound that kept feeding them. They latched onto sorrow like leeches to blood. She had to let go, not for herself, but to sever the tie. She called in sick the next day. She sat at her small table, staring at the blank screen of her phone for hours before finally typing Ace's name. She didn't send a message, just typed it, then deleted it, and wept. She walked to the bridge they once stood on during happier days. She tossed the bracelet he gave her into the river below. She whispered a goodbye into the wind. That night, she slept. No dreams, no cries, just silence. When she returned to the hospital, the mirrors were clear, the intercom silent, the pediatric ward sealed once more. She still felt the chill in the stairwell sometimes, and the elevator still paused at strange floors, but the eyes no longer followed her. The sorrow had faded. Riva still worked at St. Joseph General, still passed the same halls, but the hospital felt lighter now, as if it too had been holding its breath for her to let go. And somewhere, in the dark corners where the past still lingers, the weeping had ceased, because sorrow, when unspoken, feeds the dead. But healing sets them free. Do you have a terrifying tale of your own? Send your story to officialmrssinister@gmail.com. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell. Sleep tight if you can. And remember, the things lurking in the dark are always watching.